So I just want to quickly welcome the panelists and check that all the technical stuff is in order. So Siska, Pottie from the European Alliance for Plant-Based Foods. I know you're with us. Please unmute your microphone and you're ready. Stine Vuholm from the Danish Consumer Council is also with us.
Yes, hello.
Perfect, we can hear you. Do we have Morgan Reille? I actually don't know how to say your name.
Reille, but good morning, Annika.
Good morning, Morgan. And you're from the European Environmental Bureau. And Mr. Thomas Duffy, is he with us?
Yep.
I hear something. Perfect, you're with us. Thank you. And then I just want to give the word to Angelo Di Mambro, who is our moderator for this debate today. Welcome.
Thank you, Annika. And yes, I'm a moderator for today. We are a bit behind of schedule. I ask the panelists to, if they can, to give short answers. So because we have a lot of questions and for sure we will want to give the floor also to the audience. So a Q&A session in the final part of this debate. I would start with a question for each of you. Maybe it's the same question for all of you. I mean, it's the EU has the European Commission has tabled many proposals on make food system more sustainable. Is this legal toolkit that includes, I don't know, just to say some examples, the Farm to Fork strategy, the Fit for 55 package, the biodiversity strategy, is this toolkit fit for purpose? How can it contribute to make European food system more sustainable, in your view? I would start from the policy analyst here, that is Morgan.
Yeah, good morning, Angelo. Good morning, everyone. So for the European Environmental Bureau, supporting a transition to more sustainable food systems means to ensure a shift to healthy and sustainable diets based on both a higher consumption of local and seasonal fruits and vegetables and less and better animal-based products. The transition from intensive agricultural systems to agroecology is also key to this transition. As Alan Matthew said, the toolbox at the EU level to shift consumption is limited, and we consider that the Farm to Fork strategy is a good first step to support the transition to more sustainable food systems. Indeed, this strategy takes a holistic approach to food, looking at both environment and health. However, the Farm to Fork strategy does not go far enough, and there is no coherence between the targets of this strategy and the deal on the new common agricultural policy. So also we regret that the Farm to Fork strategy does not propose concrete measures on the consumption side to drive the transition to more sustainable food systems. And I just would like to highlight that among all the initiatives of this strategy, the most important one is certainly the Sustainable Food Systems Law. So this is a legislative proposal that the Commission is expected to publish in 2 years. And if the EU wants to ensure the transition to more sustainable food systems, we think that this legislative framework will have to drive the needed dietary shift in the EU by addressing the consumption side. And just to finish, when I say addressing the consumption side, I do not mean to put all responsibilities to consumers. I mean that actors in the middle of the food chain, like retailers and manufacturers of food service industries, must be at the center of attention in this process.
Siska, up to you. The same question. The same question.
Okay, thank you.
Have we preparing the right legal tools to address this issue?
Well, yeah, I think as Morgan said, like the ambition in the Farm to Fork and in the Green Deal is clearly the first step, and I think the current regulations or the regulations we have now is in fact the result of our I would say cultural habits and decisions in the past, which were mainly focused to foster the animal production and the animal products. So if we want to shift to a new sustainable food system, it's obviously that we also need to shift the policy and the regulatory framework. So, and also the current food law or food policies, they were created a decade ago. And at that time, the key focus was on food safety and was also on food security. So what is lacking in the current policy environment is the whole sustainability criteria and aspect. So that should be integrated. And I think there's another effort that needs to be done is to make the food policy and the policy regulations in line with the new innovative products which are coming on the market, because several regulations are not really fit to accommodate marketing of these new alternative proteins and new foods. So I think currently there are many barriers still in the regulation to address, and this is of course the key focus of the European Alliance for Plant-Based Foods, to really work on these barriers to create a level playing field for the plant-based foods, to have I would say a fair competition between the different categories. So I would say, yes, it's a great start, the ambition, but of course we have to look at how it will work out in concrete regulations, and then also translated in national initiatives, how the results will deliver. But we are very positive about the possibilities. I would say the time is now to change the regulations.
Thanks, Siska. Thomas, a farmer's perspective, a livestock farmer perspective.
I suppose I'm not directly involved in beef production, but we are involved in dairy production, which is related to it. In terms of the regulation, I suppose in a bit of preparation for this, I'm actually surprised that only, I think, Finland already apply elements in terms of trying to reduce the cost of or the support for the expansion of particularly the legume sector. Even in Ireland, which is dominated by livestock, we do not export particularly any vegetable production. We're mainly a beef, pork and dairy producer. Even we have coupled payments for the legume sector. Now, primarily these are going for feed inputs, but I mean, that's an initial element to go straight away. Needless to say, I'm uncomfortable with the idea of a taxation measure which would affect consumption of livestock production, but perhaps not why people would assume that I am, but rather because if you go down the line of taxation with a broad measure, you will actually disincentivize many of the improvements that the sector is already making. We are minimizing the emissions factor for many of our products. So if you simply bring in a broad brush approach without taking a more nuanced look, you remove any driver that we have in the sector for reducing emissions and essentially just drive us into a situation where we have unfair competition. As I say, in the likes of Ireland, where we are a very large livestock sector, we have no coupled payments whatsoever for the livestock sector, but we do have for those. So those are already allowed for inside of the regulation. I think it is very important not to mislead the consumer or to mislead anyone. You know, that the reality is the reason the livestock sector is dominant is because that is what the market is demanding. The market wants livestock production. The majority of the consumer wants livestock production. And so our democratic leaders provide for that.
So, and let me ask now, what is the perspective of consumers? Because it's a kind of vicious circles. I mean, the demand is asking for some stuff. So Alan Matthew said in his presentation that the legal toolkit from the EU addressing consumers is limited, is weak, and so on. What is the perspective of the Danish Consumer Council, Stine?
Thank you, and hello everybody. Actually, in our opinion, the EU legislation and strategies include many good initiatives to help shape and influencing consumer food purchase decisions. But we also hope for even more specific follow-up actions on many of the aspects. One of the things I would like to highlight as a key point where the EU legislation can influence consumer food purchase decisions, that is taxes, subsidies, and food prices, we think, because price is one of the most defining parameters for consumers' choices, and notably price is also ranked as one of the main barriers to eating more sustainably. So therefore, we support that the farm to fork strategy objective try to ensure that the most sustainable food also become the most affordable. So we really hope that food prices will send the right signal to consumer to foster the necessary change in the food behavior. And moreover, we also think that the EU subsidies to plant-based production could be sensitive to improve the production volume of plant-based food. And an increased availability and selection of plant-based products that also taste good. That will be a way to satisfy consumer curiosity, inspire consumers to change behavior, and make the plant-based choice even easier. And finally, there's also an issue regarding the EU promotion program, which we think could be even better aligned with the recommendations for healthy and sustainable diets, given that the current EU meat consumption levels exceed the quantities recommended for good human health and planetary health. So we hope that the promotion program will also prioritize promotion of less meat rather than better meat.
Okay, thanks, Stine. A second round of questions. These are, I have a question for one question for each of you. I will start from Siska, because you mentioned some barriers, but also we have seen two cases in the first part of the event. We have seen two cases from Nordic countries. I'm curious to know what is the situation of plant-based food in the rest of the EU. And what are the barriers, technical or regulatory barriers that you were mentioning?
Yeah, well, these two cases which were presented, they are great cases, and I think they illustrate what we need. So we really need a collaboration from the farmer throughout the producer, and then also towards the consumer. I think this is great, and this should be expanded in Europe. There are many initiatives, many, I would say, many new initiatives throughout Europe who are experimenting with these, of course, with these collaborations and trying to make. So I think we will see much more of this, but the question is, of course, can we enlarge the scale and can we make it, well, I would say the obvious way of producing. So, and to your second question, so on the barriers, today there are still many barriers. I think the first barrier we already discussed, and it was already said by all the speakers at the panel and during the presentations, it's the common agriculture policy. I think this is in a way, well, I would say a missed opportunity to really use the financial systems to accelerate the shift. Of course, there are instruments which will be beneficial and which will help to improve sustainability, but they will not accelerate the transition towards, I would say, more sustainable or more plant-based crop and legume plan. So this will not be sufficient. I think this was said by many others. But perhaps next to the public funding, I think there might also be a role for the private investors and banks, because of course they also have a huge possibility in directing their investments. And in that respect, perhaps within the European taxonomy regulation, it would be good to also include criteria for sustainable agriculture, because that might also help to redirect funding or investments from the intensive animal farming towards more the crop and legume farming. So, but next to the common agriculture policy, we also have, for instance, an instrument which is.
I lost the
I think your microphone was turned off.
I'm sorry. I didn't know how this happened, but okay. So next to the EU agriculture financing system, there's also the promotion policy. So the promotion policy also fails currently to address or to promote the less carbon intensive agri products. So the majority of the funding currently is going to the promotion of animal products. And also there, if we really want to make a shift in the diets towards more plant-based food diets, then I think also the plant-based foods which are made from crops and legumes, they should also be eligible for the promotion campaigns funded by Europe. So this is one barrier to attack. There is also another very important barrier, which is the VIT rates. So of course the VIT, so the value added tax, stands for a very significant component in the I would say in the higher price of the plant-based foods. So this, of course, is also a key barrier, because in some European member states, the VIT rate on plant-based alternatives can be 2 or 3 times as high as the VIT rate on milk and dairy. So also there, I think we need a new approach on VIT to really level the playing field for both categories. I would also think about another, it's not really a barrier, it's an opportunity. It's the, I would say, the public procurement regulation in Europe. So this is also a tool which is, of course, very, I would say, very handy to facilitate access for consumers to specific foods. And also in the public procurement regulation, there is currently no criteria for sustainability. So also there we are advocating to change this and to set minimum, I would say, minimum thresholds for plant-based food offerings in public procurement, because in that way, the audience, the consumers, they can get into contact with these new foods in public canteens, hospitals, schools, etc. What we also like to see is more public funding for research, because also there it is a young industry. It is there's still a lot of research needed. This was also expressed by the presenters. So also there, I think we should have a fair share of the public funding into further research, etc. So I can go on because there are many, but for the sake of time, I will leave it to
allow me to,
yes.
to stop you, but because I wanted to know what Thomas Duffy thinks about that. And even Thomas, there is a specific issue. Annika, in her presentation, mentioned this research saying that the market of plant-based food is expected to grow by, I think, 100 times in 2050. Is there an opportunity there for farmers? And what are the ways to go towards that?
Yeah, I suppose there's kind of 2 interesting elements. I was just rereading the report again this morning. And there's one line which doesn't receive a huge amount of attention, I think, in this discussion so far. So looking at it from a livestock perspective, it mentions that in all 3 states, meat consumption is either stable or increasing. And that's something that we see across the entire EU and across indeed the most of the developing world, that meat consumption and dairy consumption, contrary to very kind of sustained headlines, is actually going nowhere, in particular in a particular rush. I think we will see a slight decline in some generations and a slight increase in some generations and movements, and as we always do, we will see a very significant change, I suppose, in the appetites of different generations. And I've once heard a younger generation referred to as neovores, in that we like to consume new products. So there is a lot of appetite in the market for trying new products, including plant-based products. I suppose the challenge when we talk about plant-based products is a bit like talking about meat. We wouldn't necessarily lump chicken, pork, and beef in the same nutritional categories. We don't talk about them from the same environmental challenges. They have different environmental challenges. They have different environmental benefits. So when we talk about plant-based products, we're talking about a very broad spectrum here, and the benefits to farmers can range from 2 of the great presentations that we've seen here today, which are very integrated in the market and have potentials, to what is essentially a no benefit to farmers whatsoever. An increased demand perhaps for commodity product detached from the farmers. These will be bought on, and I'm thinking here of some of the very large manufacturers producing product which is essentially just buying soya and pea protein isolate on mass production. So when we talk about kind of engagement with this market, are we talking about more people moving into a market and just receiving commodity price? Are we talking about more people in an integrated system? Like the reality is, as things go mainstream and they go into own brand product, the percentage return to farmers always diminishes. Farmers are at the very bottom, every analysis that we have seen. And this is one of the big challenges for if people do want to move away from the livestock sector. The livestock sector actually receives more of the final product price than plant-based, and particularly in the crop sector. I think there is a great potential here in terms of moving, and it was identified in the report, moving a lot of cereal producers who are currently producing for the livestock feed market into the sector of supplying plant-based protein and potentially having a more benefit. And that's why I highlighted the likes of coupled payments for protein subsidy aid, which would be very significant. But the problem with trying to, let's say, change many of the market-based and the consumer-facing ones is we don't want an unhealthy increase in what are called ultra-processed foods. We want this increase in more healthy and minimally processed. And obviously we say processing, cooking is a process. So anything can be processed, anything can be unprocessed. But we do know that reformulation of many products with a very low protein substitute. And I mean, I was just looking at the earlier presentation, the organic food one. You're talking about 53% protein in that final product, which is great. I've seen other plant-based products which are supposedly substitutes for beef and chicken with less than 12% protein. So those are not actually substitutes for anything. Those are deficient in what's needed. And then we get into the whole area of quality of protein. But as I say, those are the kind of the key issues. In terms of, and I see it was mentioned here, I mean, there is a very big danger if we do expand the area into livestock production, particularly in the beef sector, and it may not be as much of an issue in Denmark and Sweden. I've visited them, but they're mostly arable-based systems. But certainly if we are talking about ploughing up grasslands, and it was mentioned there in the comments, we would actually drastically increase the amount of CO2 being released from these soils by moving them. And it's something that the EU has actually said that they want to move away from, the conversion of grasslands to arable, and indeed conversion back to it. So we have to balance all of these things. And there are interesting developments in the bio-based space in terms of extraction of grass-based proteins potentially for feeds. But as well as that, and I suppose a key thing I didn't find identified in the report, and I haven't heard mentioned here yet, is the actual agronomy involved here. Because while it's very easy to say that we should move already produced fava beans and pea products that are going to animal feed, those have to meet a grade. That means they have to meet certain climatic conditions when they're being harvested, and they have to meet certain production conditions when they're being produced. And those are far from easy things to do, leave aside whether there's demand in the market for them or not.
The rules of the season and the nature, that when you are a farmer, you have to deal with them. Stine, I would need your analytical insight in consumer behavior, your experience in consumer behavior, because in the end, it's always, it seems that this is a crucial point. What are the, concretely speaking, the enabling condition for consumers? You mentioned price, to switch towards healthier lifestyle and toward healthier diet patterns. You mentioned price is important. You mentioned so the role of taxes and so on. But what else, in your view?
Yeah. As you said, analytically, we actually have seen in a very recent survey made by the European consumer organization, BEOC, they showed that it's 2/3 of the Europeans that are open to change their food habits for environmental reasons. So the question is always, so why is it that we not yet see this reflected in the measures of food purchasing and consumption? And some might say it because people are lying in the surveys, but rather I would say it's because the realistic settings that we meet as a consumer in the supermarkets are not sufficiently supporting the good intentions that is among the consumers. So when we're doing our daily shopping as a consumer, the aim is not to save the planet. It's more short-term aims we have. It's basically to make everyday life cohesive. So consumers have to take tons of choices on their way around in the supermarket, and they use minimal time for each choice. So if the easy choice undoubtedly become the most climate-friendly choice, we have a very promising enabling condition, I think. So therefore, of course, price is a very relevant key point.
But also maybe I just make an example. Also, retailers' engagement to, I don't know, to put healthy foods in more on the foreground, let's say, to make it more visible. Maybe, I don't know. It's just
that's it. Because price is not all, and taste and quality is one of the other parameters that is very central drivers for our choices in the supermarket. So of course the product should also taste good, and this is essential if we should continue purchasing the same product. And then as you said, consumers are affected by the environment they meet when they're going shopping. So that's include marketing and advertising, promotional offers, food availability, the spatial layout in the supermarkets. So both food producers and retailers are therefore very important to help create a supportive food environment. Some examples: it should not be better to buy a big package of meat instead of a small one if we actually only need a small one, and the good plant-based product should not be hidden in the back end of the supermarket. It should be up front, so we meet it and we get inspired when we enter the supermarket.
Okay, thanks. To Morgan. We have talked about the common agricultural policy, but there are the farm to fork strategy, strategy actually. But the package, the Fit for 55, the event is hosted by Margaret Oaken, and will be the rapporteur on that. So I think this is relevant. The Fit for 55 package embeds. Foresee some strengthening of the 2030 greenhouse gas emissions target for agriculture. Can these help, and how?
Yes, so indeed, climate and agriculture are interlinked, and also the fight against the climate and biodiversity crisis and transforming our food system are issues that are interlinked. So, as Alan Matthew said in the Fit for 55 package, there are two proposals for new regulations that are relevant for agriculture. So there are namely the effort sharing regulation and the land use change and forestry regulation. And it is clear that until now, those regulations and the common agricultural policy have failed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. So this is not myself who said that, but in June, the European Court of Auditors published a new report on climate and the common agricultural policy. And the auditors concluded that for the period 2014 to 2020, more than 100 billion euros have been spent within the cap as a climate spending. And however, emissions from the agricultural sector have not decreased in the same period. And the auditors explained this failure by the fact, notably, that the cap did not provide incentives to reduce livestock numbers. So regarding the common agricultural policy, we are now at the end of the EU legislative process, because next week the Agriculture Committee of the European Parliament will vote on the deal for the future cap, and we are calling on MEPs to vote against this deal, because there is no coherence between this deal of the new cap and the climate and the food policies of the EU. To come back to the Fit for 55 package, my team has been very active on agriculture in this package, because it can create a new climate governance on agriculture and can help to transform our food systems. So what we have done with my team during the past month is that we have done a study entitled "An EEB's Pathway to Reach Net Zero Emission in the Agricultural Sector by 2050", so in line with the EU Green Deal objectives. And we worked with the EU Calc model, which is a model that projects greenhouse gas emissions reduction for each economic sector. And what we have done is that we made a list of assumptions and hypotheses on how we would like the agricultural sector to look like by 2050. So the main assumptions that we made is that by 2050, we would like food in the EU to be produced on agroecological practices. We would like also to see a phase out of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. And also, we assumed that EU consumers would adopt a flexitarian diet. And our results shows that if we ensure the transition to agroecology of the EU agricultural sector, plus we accompanied it by a change of consumer diet, we can reach net zero emissions in the sector by 2050, while at the same time to limit carbon leakage and to ensure farmers' well-being. And concretely, our pathway indicates that if our hypotheses are implemented, emissions from agriculture could be reduced by 65% by 2050 compared to 2005 levels. And we could reach a total amount of residual emissions from agriculture to an amount of 150 million tons. And we could reach the same amount of removals in the sector by restoring soils and redeploying hedges and trees in the sector. To come back to the Fit for 55 package, so as it had been said by Margaret Oken and Alan Matthews, the effort sharing regulation is key for agriculture because this regulation governs methane and nitrous oxide emissions that represent 10% of the total EU's greenhouse gas emissions. However, the regulation sets legally binding annual targets that member states must reach, and those targets cover several sectors. Further to agriculture, there is transport, buildings, and waste, for instance. And member states can focus their efforts on some sectors to achieve the national targets. And it is clear that agriculture have not been at the center of the attention of member states because the reduction of non-CO2 emissions have only contributed to 1% of the emissions reduction effort. So in our
the proposal is an opportunity to go.
Yeah,
is this a good opportunity in your view?
Yeah, it is a good opportunity because our study shows that if we promote agroecology in the EU, we could reduce by 20% non-CO2 emissions from agriculture by 2030 compared to 2005 levels. And thus to finish, we call on the EU institution to establish under the ESA a specific binding EU-level targets for non-CO2 agricultural emission of this level of 20%.
Okay, thank you. The next round, and then we will go to the Q&A session. So I invite the participants, if they have questions, to ask them in the chat. In the next round, I want to be a bit challenging, and I ask you for short answers. Let's start for Siska. We have heard in the morning also that one of the recurrent criticisms on plant-based food is that it is food with a remarkable level of processing, the so-called ultra-processed food that sometimes is not considered to be good for health. How do you ensure that the plant-based products are healthy, nutritious, and of high quality?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for the question. It's indeed an interesting question, and there's a lot of emotional debate around it. But I would say, first of all, personally, I think there is a misconception between food processing and the nutrient profile of food in general, because the health profile of a food, in my view, is not determined by the type of process, the number of process, or not even by the number of ingredients of a food. In essence, it is defined by the nutritional composition, the level of fats, the level of protein, the level of fiber, vitamins, minerals, etc. So, and then I am also always surprised that there's a kind of suggestion or a thought or a feeling that the plant-based foods are more processed. I think food processing is an issue, is done in the entire industry. So processed dairy and meat are not less processed, but and I also personally think if we want to really shift to a sustainable food system, and if we want to feed the world population sustainability, we will need processing, we will need even more processing to really optimize and maximize the use of the scarce resources, because of course we have to avoid food loss, we have to avoid food waste. So I think it's an illusion to think that we can go to unprocessed food, because what's in the name processing, they're very different processing. But having said that, that's my personal view, of course. I do think the ambition of the plant-based food is, of course, top of mind to provide healthy and sustainable and also tasty food. So there's a lot of research and innovation ongoing that really will help to further improve the composition, the recipes, the texture, and the taste. So I think we already see a lot of improvements if we compare with the first offers. For instance, in the field of the meat replacers, we see already an important reduction of the fat, of the saturated fat content and the salt. So I think this is a challenge for the entire food industry, and also within the plant-based food industry. This is top of mind to work towards. And personally, I am very confident that with the current pace of new knowledge and research, that this will accelerate, and that we will have much more healthy, innovative, and tasty food. So I think it is also a young sector, I would say, but I'm very confident with all the initiatives you see, all the investment and research put behind that. Yeah, this will be, and I am also of the opinion that it is needed not only to make them sustainable, but most of all healthy.
Yeah, yes, because it's also nutritious and tasty. With the same issue to Stine, the same question. Why plant-based food is not ultra-processed food? There are consumers advocating that ultra-processed food are bad, and so why plant-based food is not in the number of those bad things?
So, as I see plant-based food, it's actually a win-win choice. It's good for your own health, and it's good for the planetary health, and it not necessarily has to be consumed when we talk about plant-based. And we also see it's mainly the young consumers that are willing to include these protein analogs in their diet when they have to replace, for example, beef in a hamburger. But many would also prefer using chicken instead in their hamburger, or using mushrooms, or make their own vegetable beef instead. But also like just to mention that here in Denmark, as already, I think it was Annika that mentioned it, we had some new dietary guidelines here in January, and they address also the planetary health in addition to the public health, and that resulted in markedly changes in the recommendation, as more plant-based diet is now directly encouraged. It is recommended to eat less meat and then include legumes as substitutes. And unfortunately, such EU-wide guidelines was not part of the farm to fork strategy, but a relevant aspect of the communication by the Danish authorities. That is the wording they use. They call it plant-rich rather than plant-based diet. And I think that's relevant to mention, because many people associate a plant-based diet with a vegetarian or even a vegan diet, which might then be considered as an unmanageable change to do in food behavior. So therefore, the plant-rich wording is an important minor tool, but it signals that we not necessarily have to stop eating meat, but we should definitely eat less meat.
Okay, checking in on the ground, Thomas. You raise cows. Why don't you do something else? This is a provoking question, I know. Let's do something. Why don't you switch if that's so easy to do?
No, it's a very good question, and it's a question that I wish more people would ask farmers, because they'll get a very short answer. I can't. My soil is not capable of, and we know this for a fact, because so most of my area, again, I won't go into a massive history of agriculture in Ireland, but needless to say, most people associate Ireland with potatoes. Potatoes were reared for decades, and obviously we had a massive problem in 1850, which led us to finally now regaining to 5 million people after a massive collapse due to blight, but also more importantly due to export of food from our country. But I suppose even in the more recent history, there would have been a far greater spread of arable, particularly barley, oats, and wheat cultivation. The reason that my farm and most of the farms in my entire region have abandoned it is for two reasons. One, low return from the market. The yields are simply too low to justify the price. And two, degradation of the soils. So a neighbor of mine switched back a couple of years ago to cultivating barley. I had to take his land back and put it back into grassland because it became essentially unfarmable. And this is the reality on the ground for the vast majority of soils globally. The FAO's wonderful report, if anyone wants to read a really good report, livestock eating at our table or on our plate, estimated that about 77% of global soils are not suitable for cultivation. So we are talking about a very small percentage of much more productive soils that we will have to look at. In terms of cultivation, there are things that we are doing in terms of reducing our nitrogen inputs. We're not an organic farm. I have no intention of being an organic farm, but we are reducing both our inputs, our fertilizer inputs and others. And there are potentials in the kind of the sector for reducing that without going. The concern I would have particularly around the question of, because we are what's deemed an intensive by Irish standards, quite a high stocking density. Globally, I think most people think when cows are grazing, that's an extensive system, but we are quite heavily based, and there are things that we can do in terms of that. But the concern I would have is if we do extensify livestock production, we are moving into areas, and this is something that's been a very clear criticism by the JRC report of Farm to Fork, and we've mentioned it several times, that without additional measures to limit imports, we will see carbon leakage, which Alan Matthews mentioned. But also, very importantly, we'll actually increase the area under cultivation, which is not good for biodiversity, and it's certainly not good for climate change.
So, Morgan, very shortly, Thomas mentioned the fact that sometimes it's a certain method of grazing is good for biodiversity. So, but also cows are producing methane, so greenhouse gas emissions and so on. How to deal with this potential conflict on the, let's say, grazing methods good for the climate, and the fact that in the end, cows are one of the culprits, let's say, for poor cows. Morgan, how to deal with that, with this potential conflict?
Yeah, so I would say that this is a false conflict, or at least that there is no conflict between the objective between the benefits and the biodiversity of cows and reducing the climate crisis, excuse me. But however, reducing the livestock numbers is crucial for biodiversity because there is too many animals in the EU currently. At the EIB, we define the less but better principle. So this means that we call on the EU to explicitly recognize and address the need to reduce and improve the production of and consumption of meat, dairy, and eggs. And also, it is urgent now to reduce the number of cows and the farm animals in the EU to fight the climate crisis. So a few weeks ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published its new assessment report on global warming. And the experts explicitly called on policymakers to drastically reduce methane emissions if we want to respect the Paris Agreement. And currently in the EU, agriculture is responsible for 53% of methane emissions, of which 80% come from ruminant farm animals. So if we want to fight the climate crisis, we need to reduce the number of farm animals in the EU. And further to that, I would like to add that the EU production and consumption of meat have detrimental environmental and climate impacts in third countries. So I'm thinking notably on soy that we import from Brazil. And we think that the EU EU farmers should receive EU fundings to reduce their livestock population and produce more plant-based foods. And just to finish, the less but better principle also means that the Commission should not negotiate and ratify free trade agreements that will increase our imports of meat from third countries like Mercosur countries also.
Okay, thank you. Question and answer. From the audience, we have a couple of minutes, so be quick. Yes. Oh, now it's me. I'm sorry. I don't see. I can't see questions. I have seen one, but I lost it. Sorry. You always have to learn dealing with this. So, no, please, Philip, could you please write it in the chat, because we have no time. We are 5 minutes behind the schedule.
Angela, I wrote your question directly in the chat.
Oh, I don't see it. No, that's why. It's my problem. I don't see it. Sorry.
Maybe I should just say it, and then we
yes, please do it. And so, I think that this will be the only one, because we have also to leave the concluding remarks to Margaret Auken, MEP.
Right. So Rune Christopher Dragsted from the Danish Vegetarian Society had question. So he says the new proposal from the Danish government includes a national strategy for plant-based foods, including a specific plant fund for financing research and all, like a bunch of different things. Could this inspire other European countries too, and perhaps an overall EU plant-based strategy, including funding?
Who wants to take this? There is a strategy from proteins, but it's something different. Here we are in for vegetable proteins, but we are in a different area. So, who wants to take this question?
It's a difficult one, but perhaps I can try. Yeah. I don't know if I understand the question correctly, but if it's on research and on funding research for plant-based, I think we have Horizon Europe. And I think also in that European program, there's much more attention and much more possibility to introduce projects. So I think this is normally these projects are EU-wide collaborations. So I do think there is an opportunity, but now, of course, we have to make sure that the calls for proposals, so the second round, because the first are already there, have really calls for research, which really matters, because now we are also working with Bridge to Food to make the plant-based food research agenda, to make sure that the calls are in line with the research that the industry would like to do. So I think there are possibilities, but I have no view on specific national funds. It is not in my knowledge.
I can clarify that this is not just about funding research. I mean, of course, the fund is about that, but the strategy is also about actually putting the government at the head and saying we actually want to promote more protein production, local protein production from alternatives. And
but I think there are in many countries, for instance, in the Netherlands and in Belgium, I'm very much aware of this, there are programs in which they are really setting up programs nationally to assist farmers to do the transition and to do the change. So this is happening, but I think many of these initiatives are still in a test phase and in a small scale, because a lot of research and knowledge is still needed to make it widespread.
We really need to move on now. We're supposed to finish.
Yeah. So thank you to all the panelists, and the floor is yours, Annika, for and so that you